another presentation of the Moores Wargame Cop. Just a couple of announcements before we turn it over to our speaker for today. February looks like it's going to be a pretty interesting month. We'll have 3 lectures scheduled. Lieutenant Colonel Arnold David, Royal Army, will speak to us next week, Wednesday, the 3rd of February, on UK wargaming, particularly the Fight Club, Operation Thunderclap, a series of structured games conducted for, I believe, training reasons. The following week, Moores has one of their certificate classes, designing tactical games. We will then follow that up on the 17th of February with James Fielder Pigeon and Damon Coletta giving a paper that they co-wrote on synergizing mathematical game theory with ludology. Should be quite interesting from a theoretical perspective, integrating these 2 topics. Mike Bond will talk to us on the 24th of February about red wargaming. This is a topic that I think we are all interested in to see who out there is doing similar kinds of things or different kinds of things. And do not forget that the abstract submission line is open at the Moores website for the 89th Moores Symposium. The decision has not yet been made whether it will be a virtual conference in June or whether it will be in person. If it's in person, it will be at Quantico. One of the things that will be done in the in-person game and in-person conference, as well as probably the virtual conference, is that the Army War College will be sponsoring a participatory war game for those who are interested. More to follow. Oh, I apologize here. It's not Royal Army. It's, the Army. Okay, Royal Air Force and Royal Navy. My apologies for being one of the colonists that do not understand. At this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to our speaker, Dr. Phil Sabin, Professor Emeritus from King's College London. He is presented in multiple different forums. He has published multiple books and has contributed mightily to the use of wargaming for analysis, education, and training. Where our format's going to be slightly different today, please try to direct your questions to Liz and myself using the chat function, and the majority of the questions will be handled at the end of the formal presentation. Phil, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, my pleasure. Good to be with you all virtually, and thanks for the invite to talk on this topic. By chance, I'd written a paper which was circulated beforehand on a similar subject, so it's good to be able to talk to that. The subject, I think, is really interesting and gets at a number of the key design dilemmas within rigid wargames, which are my speciality. And before we get on to simultaneity, I just want to address some fundamental issues. The first is the 4 key parameters, as I've shown there, which really first came to my mind in this form when I was writing the conclusion to my Lost Battles book about reconstructing ancient battles. You can see there the full board game edition from 2011. And in the conclusion, I summarized the key importance of these 4 elements: force, space, time, and command. Force and space, I think, are the easiest to get our head around because any battle map will have both of these, the forces shown on the terrain. Time and command, it seems to me, are equally important as force and space, and also just as important as one another. And just as force and space are a pairing, so I think time and command are, and I'll certainly be treating them as such in this presentation, because I think that really helps us to understand how we can best address this challenge of modeling simultaneity. Time, of course, unlike the 3 spatial dimensions, is unnavigable. We're carried along in it like a river. That doesn't stop us wishing, and some of you will be familiar with this game, which actually highlights that, but all of the games, indeed a large number of books and films, attest to our wish to escape the river of time in which we ourselves are trapped and to voyage, albeit vicariously, to different eras in the past and the future. And war games are a key element within that. Indeed, my own particular specialism as primarily a military historian is on war game design about past conflicts rather than about present and future ones. And therefore, most of the references I'll be making today are to those past conflicts, though I think that there are certainly very important lessons that can be transferred to the more contemporary challenges with which many of you are grappling. That with regard to time. With regard to command, I'm sure you're all familiar with John Boyd's concept of the OODA loop. The notion that all of us within conflicts are constantly cycling through this decision cycle. And I think this is crucial. Of course, it takes time to go through this. How much time varies tremendously depending on how large the organization is that you're dealing with. And of course, technology, are you dependent on couriers to take your messages, or are you in instant virtual communication as we are today? But the common thread throughout all of that is to make decisions, and decisions, of course, made by people are the key element which distinguishes war games from mere simulations where everything is done automatically without player or human decision input. Those decisions are crucially affected in reality and in the game, but we're trying to model reality by the famous...
There's the codes, Jero.
What I think is interesting, particularly about the OODA loop, and it's shown here in this graphic, is there are multiple nested loops, not just between the two sides, but within one side. And effectively, it's an issue of hierarchy. The individual soldier or airman or whatever have their own. Indeed, John Boyd developed the OODA loop on the basis of his personal experience as a Korean War F-86 fighter pilot. The further up the hierarchy you go, the longer it tends to take to go round the OODA loop, partly because in order to observe and so on, you need to get reports cascaded up from the low level. And then, of course, in order to act, it's not just you personally acting, you want your organization to act, so you need to cascade down your orders, and those then need to be taken on board by lower levels, who will make their own sub-plans and pass on to their subordinates, who will make their own sub-plans. So you get this cascading feature of the OODA loop. There's not just one, there is a whole series of nested OODA loops, and this is something I will return to when we look at the simultaneity question. Anyway, so there are some fundamental concepts. How then should we model simultaneity of action in the real world? Well, it seems to me that the deluxe solution, if you have the resources, is to have a simulation or a game which is as close as possible to the experience you get in the real world. And we are now actually capable of doing it in a way that previous generations were not, through, as you can see here, real-time, networked, first-person simulation. If you're trying to simulate a platoon battle or a fighter dogfight, it's hard to get better than putting people as avatars virtually within that environment in the same real time as they would be in reality, and having them interact and essentially fight out the battle just as they would, with one, of course, absolutely crucial difference, that they're not really at risk of their lives. This is the main problem with this sort of first-person simulation, that often distortions will arise because people are not putting their lives on the line for real as they would be in a real war. But if you're going to try and overcome that by, for example, moving to gladiatorial games, as the Romans did, frankly, you might as well just fight the real war rather than bothering about simulation. But this, it seems to me, is the acme, and we are now able to do this in a way that previous generations could only literally dream of. The problem is, except for the lowest level clashes, like the ones I've identified, this is impractical because we simply do not have the resources that are required to run, for example, the whole country as a network first-person simulation, so that we can have a political military game of a crisis. So we need to cut our coat according to our cloth. We need to scale. and we need to look for flexibility. And it seems to me there are two ways in which we're looking to change things with regard to the acme of the real-time first-person simulation to allow us to do something which is cheaper and indeed more flexible. The first one, of course, is limiting required player numbers. We want to be able to simulate events involving thousands, possibly even millions or tens of millions of people without needing that many players. Perhaps we only want to have 2 players, perhaps only 1 player. But anyway, somehow we need to get away from the idea that every single human needs to be represented by an avatar making their own decisions. And the other thing we're trying to do is to change the passage of time. As I say, in real time, in the real world, we cannot escape the river of time. In games, we want to modify the rate of the passage of time. Usually we want to speed it up so that a crisis or a war taking years doesn't take years to play. Sometimes, I have to say, we want to slow it down, because especially when you don't have 1 player per human in the real situation, sometimes you need more time in order to get a handle on what's going on. But at any rate, you're trying to modify, be it to speed up or to slow down, the passage of time simulated in the game. And of course, you want to vary it so that at times when nothing much is happening, you can accelerate through in the way that we can't in the real world, of course. Whereas when a lot of things very interesting are happening, you perhaps want to slow it down. So we want to be gods in that sense. We want to step out of the river of time and play with it in all sorts of ways and have single players who are able to be effectively gods without just being limited to 1 human avatar as we are in the real world. Looking at the entertainment industry in video gaming, this finds its expression most clearly in real-time strategy games. They're running constantly. They're usually running at an accelerated rate, not at real time, but they are running constantly. The players have the godlike perspective that you can see here. They can click on and order their units, and there's an opposing player or the computer as the opponent who's trying to fight you. And so you have this real-time pressure. There is certainly this modeling of simultaneity. Both sides in a 2-player real strategy game are able to do things simultaneously, just as in the real world. The problem with this, of course, is it becomes, because of the accelerated time pressure of trying to do everything for lots of avatars within often a speeded up version of reality, that it becomes a click fest. There's very little time for reflection or study. You're just trying to change people's orders as quickly as possible to try to get one over on the opponent. You're trying to do similar sort of things in reality, of course, but you're not in that case a god who's able to give simultaneous orders to all of these avatars simultaneously. More particularly with regard to serious war games as opposed to entertainment-based games, we have, of course, pausable real-time games. Try to have the best of both worlds by allowing you to stop real-time, but still interact with the system, still to observe, still to give orders. What I've shown here is the command mission series, one of the command mission series, and here they call it We Go. And the idea here is that you can have 2 players. They simultaneously plan during a pause, take as long as they wish, and then when they're both ready, they press a button, and the simulation then works out the next usually minute of action. And the players can watch that. They can't interact with it at that point. They just watch how their orders are implemented, see what the enemy does. But they can stop it, they can rewind, they can watch it from different perspectives to allow them, of course, to have an overview which is not just limited to that of a single avatar within a real-time simulation like the ones I showed you earlier. As soon as one has something like that, where you're giving orders and then letting the system run them for you, you immediately see the problem of simultaneous orders being given, which then clash with what the opponent is doing, and the avatars would use their initiative. If, for example, you'd ordered that tank to just drive straight down the road, and the enemy at the same time had ordered another tank to turn a corner and come out and drive straight the other way down the road, in real life, the tanks wouldn't just pass one another waving. they would do something about it. They would use their initiative. So within the combat mission system, there is artificial intelligence, which means that the units that you've given orders to will do something else, will use their initiative based on changing circumstances before you get another chance to issue orders. Now, that need for artificial intelligence to resolve clashes between simultaneously given orders being executed when you're not in a position to click as you are in a real-time strategy game has been built on, particularly by Panther Games, in a very interesting system which makes tremendous use of the capabilities of modern computing, whereby effectively the whole of a battle, it's the Command Ops series, and this shows the Highway to the Reich scenario, the whole of the battle at a operational level is run by the AI. So effectively, this is a simulation. The whole thing could just take place based on AI and orders that have been given and default orders and so on that are within the system. And you can then dip in at any point and to whatever level you wish, and you can override those orders, but the system will run things otherwise. What this allows is what the designers call painfully realistic command delays. I showed you the hierarchy, the OODA loop hierarchy before, and it's long been recognized that in at least traditional operations, for a divisional level operation, you need to plan it a day in advance, a game day in advance. This system allows you to do that. If you are playing the divisional commander, you can create a wonderful plan for a divisional attack, but the system will not execute your plan until tomorrow in game terms. Meanwhile, all it's doing is doing as best it can with the orders you gave yesterday in game terms. And of course, this is something that is only possible because of artificial intelligence allowing the system to replicate the initiative of most of the people involved, and your orders, your player decisions are just overlaid onto that and delayed where necessary. Now, that's fine with the wonders of computing. What about with manual games? Well, long before modern computers became available, people recognized that they would like to have some sort of modeling of simultaneity. And in the 70s in particular the SBI company, tried to integrate this into some of their tactical games. They had simultaneous movement plotting pads. Usually you had just one map and both sides were looking at it. There might be units hidden which were noted on your plot, but you needed to give orders to those units to literally write them out. The opponent did the same, and then you executed. And this, again, you had this problem: what happens if the orders clash? And there needed to be all sorts of procedures to resolve that. The city fight system used a rather more streamlined version of that, where all you did was place a counter on the units simultaneously and secretly at the start of each turn. Are they going to move? Are they going to fight? And so on. But the central principle is you simultaneously and secretly plot your moves, and then the turn is resolved to some degree simultaneously, though of course in manual games it's much harder mechanically to do that. These sorts of simultaneous move plotting games tended to die out, not completely, and we'll see some fields in which they persisted, but particularly in land operations, they tended to die out because they were just too much of a faff. I think it's important to note that does not mean that simultaneous plotting of what you're going to do in the turn, a simultaneous turn, is completely impractical. It can be done. You just need to make the game incredibly simple in order that it be practical. Here's a couple of examples from games that I've designed which do actually use simultaneous move plotting. The pictures show you the same game. It's Schlieffen. It's the Western Front in August and September 1914. It's played without even an umpire. It's played, as you can see, between pairs of people double blind. And the key point here is the emphasis is on the fog of war. Because the emphasis is on the fog of war and you're keeping secrets from the opponent anyway, it's not too much extra effort to simultaneously plot what your forces are going to be doing in a simultaneous turn. you're already keeping secrets, you might as well have simove on top of that. The smaller map shows you something I designed very recently, but exactly the same principle. It's called Block Fight. It's a symmetrical game about urban operations in the modern world. And the key elements within both of these games are that there is a front line. Each of you has a separate map hidden from the opponent. You know where your forces are. You don't know where the enemy are, but you do know that they are in their territory and you are in yours. So what you're doing in both cases is that you are moving your forces within your own territory simultaneously, just as the enemy is doing, secretly, and you are plotting your attacks by putting some of your units on the borders between your own and an enemy zone, committing yourself, therefore, to launch those attacks. The way that this is resolved to avoid some of the issues that we saw with the computer versions is that there is a strict sequence within the games of how to resolve clashes between plotted actions. And in both cases, it is as follows. All movement precedes all combat. So any moves that you're making, you simply make the moves in your own map. They have all happened before any combat is resolved. And then you have a simple sequence rule, which says, in the case of block fight, for example, the red player declares an attack first. And that is then resolved, and then the blue player declares an attack, and so on until all have done. And one attack can preempt another, but there's never any doubt in these ultra simple games as to what is supposed to be happening next. So you have simultaneous movement with some very simple rules of how to resolve clashes between these simultaneous orders that have been issued. And it works. It works very well. The game can be played by people who know the system in 10 minutes. So simultaneous move plotting is not impractical as long as you keep this game system incredibly simple. The trouble in reality, of course, is that the point of the war game is to model something rather more subtle and nuanced than the examples I've just given. And once you're trying to play a serious war game, as opposed to just something which is almost designed just to showcase simove and fog of war, you run into problems. The picture shows the early development of the Camberley Kriegspiel, which I'm sure you'll hear something about in the UK Wargaming talk upcoming. And here are my colleagues who were helping us to design this. And there again, you'll see the fog of war, that the two people sitting back to back are playing one another, red versus blue, and John Drivenkovich there is the umpire with the master map. Even for something that we tried to keep relatively simple, but not so simple that people would just regard it as Ludo, the overhead in terms of running things simultaneously as well as keeping fog of war and having the umpire trying to keep their tabs on all of this is enormous. And although this system has continued, it's been developed further by Ivor Gardner in particular in the British Army, and is a live training aid there. It's very, very difficult to run it, and the umpire in particular has an enormous load upon them, trying to keep in their heads what's going on. The other thing about which this experience showed us is it's particularly difficult if you try to do everything as a rigid game, which is the topic today. If you do it more freely, if basically you have no rules, the Camberley Kriegspiel does have some, but if you have no rules, a genre that Tom Mowat in the UK has specialised in, then as long as you're Tom Mowat or someone equally genius in this, you can actually run these things as an umpire, going back and forth, making things up on the fly, making decisions, being God, and so on. But particularly for rigid manual games, trying to have any kind of detailed system which has any real pretensions to reflect reality, at the same time as having simultaneous plotting, secrecy, and so on, is a very, very big overhead. And people immediately start to say, hey, hang on, isn't this something we should be using computers for instead? For all sorts of reasons, then, there's a continuing attraction of open game systems, by which I mean, as you can see here, that there's one map, there isn't any secret plotting going on, everybody can see what's going on, everybody can share their ideas. It's often done as a more collegial sort of experiment with the simulated reality. You can catch it when other people are making mistakes about the rules before it completely destroys the game, as it would do in a game where they're making decisions completely in isolation or plots secretly. You can talk together, you can interact in normal ways, and so on. So open game systems can be tested more easily, they can be played solitaire. There are all sorts of advantages to them. You can see why they have not been completely or even in large part displaced by the Kriegspiel model of separate red and blue players operating independently. The game that's shown there, by the way, this is my old office at King's College, and this is a classic, very memorable occasion when we tested the rapid campaign analysis tool set, and standing up there you can see the two key designers of that, which was designed in the UK for application to contemporary crises, but had to be validated by testing it against historical ones. Here we are replaying the Falklands campaign of 1982, and seated there on the left you can see a couple of the real commanders of the amphibious forces, Mike Clapp and Julian Thompson. But the point is, here we have an open game system. People can share ideas, they can operate in this collegial way. What it does do, though, is make it particularly problematic to model simultaneity directly in the way that I've discussed earlier. So what do people do in open game systems as an alternative to get some sort of feel for simultaneity? Well, in what's been called, I think, third generation manual game design, which we have been in actually for decades, the standard approach is one or other form of interleaved impulses. Rather than having all one side activated and then all the other side activated completely separately, which I'll talk about later, they interleave impulses so that there's less of a sense of alternation on block between the two sides. And as I say, there's many forms of this. This is one of the earliest games which pioneered that. It's Storm over Arnhem. And each turn starts with everybody fresh and ready to operate. And then each player in turn chooses one group, one stack, let's say, and activates them, moves them, fires them, whatever. And when they have done that, they are flipped over. You can see some of the German army units in white that have been flipped over. They're done. They're spent for the turn. They can't do anything else except defend themselves, and that not very well, if they're attacked. So the dynamic this creates is that some people are activated and then others leap in and perhaps counter-attack them and are counter-attacked in turn. It's an interesting dynamic. It's certainly interactive, and it creates a situation where you've actually got an interest often in waiting and letting the enemy activate their forces, and then with your fresh forces coming in and punishing them. And you can wait by passing. But then if the other side passes in turn, you're both waiting, and therefore the turn ends, with often quite a lot of forces left unactivated that turn. And some people see this as a bonus of the system, that reserves kept idle have nevertheless played a role, and it mirrors, to some extent at least, some perceptions of reality. So that's one form of interleaved impulses. Another form is shown in this game. This is across 5 Aprils about the American Civil War. And here the focus is on randomness. They wanted to create a very confusing game system. So here you put chits representing each core on both sides into a cup. You draw them out randomly, and when that chit is drawn, that's when the core is activated and moves and fights. You have no control over when that's going to happen. Even combat phases are actually in the cup, so you don't even know when the combat's going to be resolved. That, by the way, is one of the drawbacks of the system, because it means that defensive terrain is undermined, because you simply wait until your attack phase counter has been drawn, and then you move up next to the defensive terrain, and then the next draw is at some point is going to be the enemy attack phase, which means they need to attack you and they've lost the benefits of the stream they were defending behind or whatever it might be. But anyway, the point here is randomness to get some sort of indirect reflection of simultaneity of operations. And there are plenty of games, and this is probably the majority now, where they try to give players the choice as to when to go, and the better their commanders, the more chance they have of going when they want. So the more the command asymmetry, the more that you're going to be able to seize the initiative, wait as long as you like, but then operate and activate as much as you want at your chosen moment to be able to get the drop on the opponent. There's sadly the sort of box art on the left, which gives Wargames a bad name as closet Nazi sympathizers. But Richard Berg sadly recently died in his famous Men of Iron system using continuous activation. He doesn't even have turns as such. He just has a sequence of back and forth impulses where you are trying to activate whatever you can to get something done before the enemy gets the chance to do it back to you. Now, this might seem the Holy Grail, and to many people, interleaved impulses do seem to have answered the problem of modeling simultaneity the best that one can possibly do, unless one is playing a computer game where you can go to the Panther Games artificial intelligence approach. But I'm not actually that sold on interleaved impulses as the Holy Grail for manual game design, and let me suggest why. First of all, they do have a significant overhead in themselves. Just running a system whereby you're either choosing or randomly generating orders of activation does take longer than some other systems do. But it also has a very strange relationship with time. Imagine a tactical game where one unit is activated and starts moving across a field into the line of fire of an enemy machine gun. The enemy machine gunner then in an impulse-based system has a choice. They either fire or they wait. If they fire on the enemy squad, let's say, that's moved into the field, they're now spent. So another squad can come from another direction or even across the same field and can move up quite freely because the machine gun has now fired. Now, that seems to me to pose a very difficult relationship with time within a turn. If what's happening within the turn is these impulses are actually taking place successively in game time, what does spent mean? Why can't people who've done something in the morning, let's say, do something again in the afternoon? If it's a different time. If, on the other hand, it's the same time and the impulses are merely interleaving in order to try and give an illusion of simultaneity, why couldn't the machine gun wait and see these people simultaneously advancing across the field and choose their appropriate target then, rather than gambling that the enemy have moved the most lucrative target that they're going to across the field already? So it does seem to me that there is this problem within within the impulse-based system. What does spent units actually represent, and what significance does this delay have of activating people afterwards? Is it later in game time? That's one, I think, quite serious problem, to me the most fundamental problem with this system. The other one is, we talked earlier about OODA loops, and it does seem to me that the OODA loop mechanic is very much undermined by the impulse-based system, because you're able, as soon as you see an opportunity, as soon as you're able to activate someone, you can immediately leap in and orders are executed instantly so that you can seize that opportunity. That, as we know, is not the way it happens in the real world. If you're a division level commander, you're not going to be able to do things that quickly. And yet in an impulse-based system, you do get this impulse-by-impulse opportunism, which doesn't seem to me well to model the OODA loop delays that I've talked about. So it doesn't seem to me that the impulse system, however popular it may be and however whatever strengths it has, it is the complete answer to indirect modeling of simultaneity. You could describe chess as the ultimate impulse system. It's certainly very, very interleaved. And as you know, each person just activating one piece at a time. You can't get any more interleaved than that. Chess, though, of course, does have one big difference from the impulse systems I've described so far, namely that the piece that's been activated is not spent. If you wish, on your next turn, you can continue activating it as long as it's not been taken. So a queen, for example, could go turn after turn after turn, and often does. Therefore, there's nothing like the same problem in chess with what does spent mean as you get in a system where each piece within a turn can only be activated once. There are games which, building off perhaps the chess idea, don't allow all your units to be activated each turn. On the left there you see victory in Normandy, where depending on how much supply the Allies have landed, they can activate a certain number of stacks. But a lot of their forces are just going to sit there for the turn. The same with the Germans. Supply can be the limiting factor. Command can be the limiting factor in my lost battle system. Nobody does anything unless they're given commands, and the player can choose to focus those commands on part of the battle line and leave the rest effectively idle for that turn. And I think that this has quite a lot going for it and is not used enough, because in reality you did not see every month, for example, every single division moving up to the limit of its capability, and supply and command scarcity was often the reason for that. So that does seem to me to have quite a lot going for it in terms of simulating reality without creating spent forces, because the same units you activated last month can be activated, or last week, or yesterday, I think it's daily turns in Victory in Normandy, can actually be activated the next day as well, if you choose to continue to give them the supply. Within turns, the sequencing of your player actions within a turn becomes problematic in itself. The standard is you move everything and then you fight any enemy that you end up next to. That's obviously rather unrealistic. What you should be able to do is to use the time within a turn as you wish, and different units can use it in different ways. So there are a number of games which give operations points rather than movement points to a unit, and they can use them to attack and then move and then attack again and whatever, and each of those actions has a particular cost. That's fine as long as you're just using individual units. The problem comes when you're trying to coordinate the spending of operations points across multiple units, as in this game, Trial of Strength, which takes attempts to make operations flexible, really to the limit I've ever seen within a manual game. What you need to do, of course, is to have a situation where if you move up a unit all the way from the rear and it ends near the enemy and can then attack, the unit next to it, which has started next to the enemy, should not, in reality, be able to use its first operations points to join in the same attack, benefit from the support it's getting from the unit that's come all the way from the rear, and then use all its movement to run riot behind the enemy lines. What would actually need to happen is it would need to waste operations points, waiting for its friends to join it, and then it would have very limited amount of time left to do things. It takes a hell of a lot to track that. The designers of Trial of Strength try to do it, then they computerize the game for I think, quite understandable reasons. But it shows this problem of sequencing of movement and combat across multiple units within a game turn. Another fundamental choice is, do you go for many short turns or fewer longer turns? And this is a key design decision. I faced it myself within the game that you see here, and contrasting that with the old Punic Wargames from SPI. Both are on the same topic. I model based on a student design by Garrett Mills from my course years ago, using 10 to 15 day turns, back and forth, with each side only be able to do one action, like ravage or march or confront the enemy or whatever, before the enemy gets a chance to do something back. At the other extreme, the Punic Wars game that you can see has yearly turns. It uses operations points, so your forces can move and fight and move and fight again and so on, while the enemy for that year just stays stationary. and then they get the chance to do the same back to you. You might think, well, obviously you need something more interactive than that. Well, you say that, but of course the Punic Wars game is designed to model the entire Punic Wars, and therefore 20 turns or so. And trying to do that with 10-day turns will get rather tedious. So there are real trade-offs to be made here of how much interactivity you build in via how many turns you try to squeeze into the game. Let's just look at reality for a minute. What happens in real land warfare? You see here the situation at Stalingrad, famously in the eve of Operation Uranus in November of 42. The Germans, of course, having conducted a great mobile operation to reach Stalingrad, are now very much bogged down there and have been spending months trying to take the last vestiges of the city. Meanwhile, the Germans, the Soviets, have been preparing to attack them on the flanks and the weak Romanian divisions, and they're about, of course, to launch the encirclement, which cuts off Stalingrad around here. The next phase of that, of course, is that the Soviets, having conducted that attack and met up at Kalach, defend themselves and regroup and so on. Meanwhile, the Germans get together a counterattack, the famous Operation Winter Storm. They launch it not from here, because this is obviously well defended by the Soviets, but from here, further away from the pocket, gets about halfway, and then is itself preempted by Soviet reactions, not least a further attack, Little Saturn, against the Italians up here on the Don, which forces all the Germans to withdraw. The point being, what you're seeing here is a classic of successive offensives and counter-offensives. You're not seeing, very often at least, simultaneous offensives by the two sides meeting in a meeting engagement. The default state of land forces, 90% of the time, they are sitting there waiting for something to happen, waiting for the enemy to attack them. And attacks and counterattacks therefore go in against a static opponent most of the time. Even during a highly mobile operation, and you can't get much more mobile than Operation Barbarossa in 1941, if you look at Stahl's detailed study of some of the motions of the Panzer divisions during that, you'll see that the movement is by no means even. There are days when this Panzer division moved 90 or 100 kilometers, but there are even more days when it moved less than 10 kilometers. Stop-go is the norm within operations, rather than constant movement at a constant pace, even when you have the initiative and you're the one who's doing the attacking. This is the kind of thing that we need to model within our simulations. So if we go back to basics to a game that was designed almost 60 years ago, Stalingrad, very unrealistic game, but nevertheless very popular at the time, and for good reason, using the very primitive system, as we now see it, of I go, you go. Alternate player turns, in each of which you move everything of your forces, and then once you've moved it, you attack the enemy, and then the enemy does the same back to you. Symmetrical I go, you go turns. Well, at least this does a passable job of modeling what I just showed you with the Stalingrad example, where you have successive attacks against weak points on of your static defensive line. Moving before attacking allows the attacker in an open game such as this to see where the enemy are weak, to move forces to that point and to attack them. Conscious, though, all the time that the enemy are going to be doing the same back later that turn, and therefore they better leave at least some defense elsewhere in their line so that the enemy doesn't have a free go and be able to encircle. So back and forth it goes. This system, for all its many faults, actually does reasonably well in modeling the reality that we just looked at of successive offensives or counter-offensives against an at least temporarily static enemy that you can attack at their weakest point. If you read my article, you'll have seen this diagram. What I've added to it here is the OODA loops, because it does seem to me that as long as you think of the I go, you go model not as both sides operating within exactly the same terms chronologically, but in an alternating system of what I've called leapfrog, where the player turns overlap with the previous player turn of the opponent and the successive player turn of the opponent in the way that I've shown. Then you have a way that you can model OODA loop delays. You can force people to sit on their hands while they're planning and trying to get something done quite well. If you set the OODA loop timescale at the operational level or whatever level you're modeling within the game as the primary decision level for the players, if you set it to that sort of timescale, then you can have a situation where each player within the first half of their player turn is watching with trepidation what the enemy are now doing to them. They can't react instantly to it because there is no instant reaction in warfare. They're watching that. They're getting reports in about what happened with their own attacks or movement from the previous turn. And then they're giving orders, which are then executed in the second half of their player turn. So the action takes place in the second half of your player turn, and at that point the enemy is observing, orienting and deciding what to do about it, and then does it back. That seems to me to capture quite well what we've just seen as the reality, certainly of land warfare, without needing artificial delays that the pieces won't move as you wish until next turn or the turn after, which is something very difficult to do unless you're using artificial intelligence within a computer. So it does seem to me that IGO-UGO has quite a lot going for it to model reality, including in particular the OODA loop delays. Now, as I said earlier, the OODA loop delay at one level is very different from the OODA loop delays at the lower levels. But again, this is not something that IGO-UGO games have been ignorant of. Indeed, they've developed quite a lot of systems which will allow them to abstractly model that lower level initiative. There's a game from the 70s about the Chinese farm battle in 1973, and it involves two key elements of this. One is zones of control, and the other is artillery final protective fire. Zones of control basically mean that as soon as the enemy moves next to your unit, they've got to stop and maybe they need to attack and engage in combat. That simulates lower level initiative, that your forces don't just sit there like lemons and let the enemy run around them. When the enemy come near, they get stuck into a battle against an at least locally active unit. And final protective fire simply allows the enemy artillery to concentrate at the point where you're attacking, just as your artillery can concentrate to support your attack. And it means, therefore, it's harder to jump on weakness because the enemy can counter-concentrate their artillery fire or their air power or whatever it might be. And it's all about an automatic means, a manual equivalent of AI, if you like, of modeling this lower level initiative. Opportunity fire, designated reserves who have their own movement phase within the enemy player turn. These are all other ways in which you can model lower level reactivity and the hierarchy of the OODA loop that I've shown there. I talked about decisions on how long the turns should be in terms of turn scale. There's possibly one of the most popular games of all time, and arguably also the most complex manual games of all time, Advanced Squad Leader. The two are not unrelated. And that has quite long turns. Infantry can move quite a long way. They can shoot multiple times. The enemy can shoot at them multiple times. A lot is going on. There's a lot of subsequences within that game's sequence of play. I prefer, in the number of land battle tactical games I've designed, much shorter turns in which you can only do a very limited number of things, and only one of those. Basically, you can do one of three things. You can move one hex, you can fire, or you can recover from suppression. And then it's the enemy turn, and they get to do one of the same three things back to you. That I found is far simpler and actually creates quite a good model without the challenges, for example, of opportunity fire and so on during the enemy player turn, which creates automatically situations whereby the passive defender, the hidden defender, gets the first shot against the moving opponent automatically because you can't move and fire. And when you're, as I've shown here, crossing a street and an enemy machine gun opens up, the red arrows there, they can pin you down. And what happened in this case is that one of my units was pinned down crossing that street and wasn't able to escape and was taking casualties for several turns by nature of this very simple turn sequence. But that's all based on having multiple interleaved turns rather than lots of interleaved subsequences within a few much larger, longer scale turns. The OODA loop, of course, was designed so that not people would have equal-sized OODA loops, as I've shown with the leapfrog model, but precisely so that you would have an OODA loop quicker than the opponent, and you could literally get inside the enemy decision loop. Is this something that Wargames simply cannot do if they're divided into turns, because you could not practically have turns of different length of the two sides? Well, again, designers have been way before you, and they've thought of this. Just because you have equal length turns matching one another does not mean to say that what you can do within each turn needs to be symmetrical between the two sides. The game here is Red Star Rising, and it shows a situation where one side, the Germans in this case, are seen as much more proficient operationally, and are therefore able to have a much more flexible phase sequence, moving and then fighting and then moving again to break through the enemy and so on, whereas the Soviets are much, much more rigid. They might need to move up and then fight the next turn, so they telegraph their punches, they don't get the exploitation and so on. So by using asymmetric, uneven phase sequences within equal length turns, you can get indirectly at many of the things that John Boyd was talking about, getting inside the enemy decision loop. There's one kind of asymmetry which is called here serendipitous, and it actually allows you to simulate simultaneity very simply, while at the same time modeling the strategic asymmetry. If one side has a big advantage, you can have a turn sequence which is not I go, you go, it's I move, you move, and then we resolve combat. Obviously, moving second on block gives you a huge advantage there, but that's what simulates the strategic asymmetry. The examples I've shown, one is the simple second Punic war game that is in my book, and the Romans by this period had sea control, didn't need to march across the Alps with elephants and so on like Hannibal did, and therefore they simply get to move second before combat is resolved jointly between the two sides. A huge advantage, but modeled by a very, very simple sequence of play. Same thing in Victory in the Pacific. In this case, it's the US intelligence advantages, which mean that the US fleets get to move second after the Japanese, and then combat is resolved in the positions that both have reached at the end of that turn. There are quite a lot of situations where this kind of asymmetry exists and can be profitably tackled, therefore, by simple sequencing. Guerrilla warfare has always seemed to me the classic one. People often ask, oh, how on earth can you simulate guerrilla warfare? And I say, well, a very simple means is as follows. You have lots of counterinsurgency units and a very few guerrilla units, but all the counterinsurgency units have to move first, then the guerrilla units can move as they want, then you resolve combat. So the counterinsurgents can never find the guerrillas, who usually have better intelligence, of course, and wherever the counterinsurgents have not left garrisons, that's where the guerrillas go and mass and destroy a base or whatever it might be. So by simple move sequencing, you can reflect strategic asymmetries like those in, for example, guerrilla warfare. Now, to finish, I've talked so far about land warfare primarily. What about the special challenges of air and naval games? What makes this particular challenge for simultaneity is, whereas the default state of land forces is to stand on the defensive, the default state of naval and air units is to move. So whereas meeting engagements are very much the norm, sorry, the exception in land warfare, they are de rigueur in air and naval warfare because of the nature of the platforms involved. No surprise, therefore, that computer games like Air Power, John Tiller's game, or the Command game here have carved out quite a niche in this regard, because they can automatically keep these forces moving just as they can in real-time strategy games. Operational games, where you're keeping secrets from the opponent, as I said earlier, tend to be ones where the overhead, the extra overhead of simultaneous planning isn't that great compared to what you're already paying. So if you're doing a game like the Sinking of the Bismarck, for example, or the Search for the Bismarck, then you're already doing secret plotting. You might as well plot simultaneously where your forces are going to move in the coming turn. Other games like the Burning Blue here, you have to plot far more than just the turn in advance. The attackers have to plot the entire raid, because historically that's what they would have to do. It can become a little boring in some cases for the attacker then to play through it, but you are simulating the simultaneity of planning and the working out of secret orders and so on. When you get to tactical games, which is more my area of interest, that's when it tends to come apart. I said earlier that simultaneous move planning in manual games tended to die out, and it did indeed in the 70s with regard to land games, but it very much remained popular, and still even is to some extent, within air and naval games, because it does seem to many people to capture well the fact that both sides are moving at once, and therefore, in order not to give one or the other side the advantage, you'd better have them both plotting secretly. And here's a couple of games that do that. The problem here is once you have forces that are literally in sight of one another, the real OODA loops are much, much quicker. Just play a computer air combat game and you are reacting in much less than a second to what the enemy plane, the enemy pilot is doing. Because your OODA loop is incredibly tight. It's just you and your control column. So a system like Air Force, where you're guessing 10 seconds in advance where the enemy will be, it's just not real. Therefore simultaneous plotting, particularly in air tactical games, does seem to me to be a very inappropriate way of handling the simultaneity challenge. There are other ways of doing it. One is sequential movement. The Mike Smith games, for example, you dice for initiative, and then the force that loses moves all its forces that turn, and then the other side moves, and then you resolve combat. The fact that the initiative can go back and forth means that there is this pendulum of advantage, but that's entirely artificial. And whichever side happens to win the initiative that go gets a huge advantage in terms of being able to position its forces exactly in relation to what the enemy has done and is now obvious to it. So that doesn't seem to me to be a very good answer to the problem. The interleaved movement is often used, particularly in air games, and again, where you try to have a situation where one plane moves and then another plane of the other side moves and then a plane of your side moves, so that you even out the disadvantage, and you can try and make sure that if you tail the enemy, that plane moves first, then you move after it, but then another plane that's tailing you moves after you, and so on. And it can work, but it does get a bit difficult trying to work out sometimes in complex situations, okay, who's actually got the initiative, who should be moving now and who should be waiting, and so on. But that's, again, the dominant form as it is currently. And there are significant trade-offs here between turn scale and playing time. Flight Leader is a classic game of modern tactical jet combat. But within that, an F-16, for example, within a single turn, can literally turn right round and get right round behind the plane that was on its tail, because the turn is, in that sense, too long for the OODA loop. Here, from the same game, is an optional system of impulses, where literally you have 20 impulses within a single turn, and you move one hex, depending on your speed, where it shows M. And of course, that's much, much, much more interactive and much more real, but you can imagine how long it takes, which is why it's an optional rule. So this trade-off between turn scale and playing time becomes particularly acute in tactical air and naval games. In the old days, we didn't need to worry about this. People just had I go, you go. They moved their planes, they fired their planes at the end of their go, and then the enemy did the same, and then you started another turn. And you might think, well, that's ridiculous, because planes don't just stop in the air while their enemies move and literally have that stop-go, as happens to some extent on land. Well, you say that, but actually, it seems to me that going back to this apparently primitive system doesn't have as many disadvantages as you might think. All the designs that I've done recently on air warfare have been of this form. What's key in tactical air warfare? Tailing the enemy, covering your plane so that if the enemy gets on their tail, you can attack you can counter-attack and so on. Well, I go, you go. The leapfrog system I've shown allows that to happen. Here is a side view from my dogfight game. This flight has just attacked the bombers in an I go, you go sequence. All the red moves are the Allied moves. The Allies now will freeze in place, as it were. The bombers will move on, and then this guy will get to come in and counterattack this attacking interceptor. The bombers having cleared out the way. But that's not where it ends, because this guy has reached a covering position on this guy, and therefore, once this guy has attacked him, he will leap down and counterattack and so on. So you get this position of being able to model through the leapfrog system, albeit indirectly and abstractly, exactly the kind of covering mechanics which occur in real air warfare. You can also, by the way, and this plane shows a turn, you can have two flights which, and these are flights rather than individual planes, you can have two flights circling and they are literally covering one another. There is no loose end to worry about. And of course the defensive circle all the way from World War I has been a classic air combat mechanic. Again, the shorter you make the turns, the less artificial it becomes. My fighter duel system is a very tactical model. Individual planes, it's focusing on individual formation combat. And you see here, it's top down, and the turns are actually just 3 seconds. It allows you to, and this was an experimental game of ME-262's bouncing P-51s, it allows you to model, as you can see here, and to experiment and to get energy plots showing the way that the total energy of the forces declines over time. But when you try and play it with people in an occasion such as this, Connections Conference, it takes a lot longer, and we weren't able to get more than a few turns played, and certainly not to get any kind of decision reached. So you have this trade-off in terms of the time that the game actually takes. Naval stuff, it's a bit more difficult because unlike planes, which at least historically fired forwards, naval vessels tend to fire to the side. That means they tend to fire mutually and simultaneously, and that's made I go, you go rather problematic for naval operations. Not entirely so. CA is actually an I go, you go game, entirely symmetrical player turns. In this case, you fire and then you move. What that tends to create, though, is a situation where you fire at the enemy, and then before they can fire back at you, you scoot off. And if you're really clever, you scoot behind Savo Island so they can't fight back at you at all, unless they chase you, in which case you do the same again, and you never get fired on, and they just get blown to pieces. I go, you go struggles with the broadside mutual nature of naval fire. But again, you just need to show a bit of initiative, and instead of having the fire at the start of your turn or at the end of your turn, you put it in the middle. This is a game I designed on, a very simple game, on Napoleonic naval combat, and you move one or at most two hexes, then you fire, then you move again. And then the enemy does the same. It's entirely symmetrical I go, you go, but it works much, much better to solve the problems I've highlighted. You also need to have facing, and you need to have realistic constraints on facing, so that you're not always going into the enemy firing and then going away, because facing changes are limited. But anyway, it shows that I go, you go, even for something as difficult as this, can be applied. Especially as we move to the more modern world, all aspect weapons, long range weapons, weapons which fire, which have a good chance of killing the enemy at the first shot, guided weapons and so on. These pose problems. They make simultaneity vital, it seems to me. They make it particularly important to know who's shooting first, because it's like a Western gunfight. Simultaneity in itself doesn't address that, because you do need to know, are one side's shots reaching the enemy before the enemy can do anything back to you, in which case it's not simultaneous, it's a wipeout. Commonly, flight times become an issue here. And especially in air warfare, you get a situation where you fire a missile, the enemy fires a missile back at you before either side's missile reaches the target. That can be modeled with an I go, you go, but as in the Sunstrike game that I'm working on, you need to have some sort of delay built in. The way I do it here is that you only resolve the impact of your weapons the next turn. That allows the enemy to fire back at you, and you can actually have nuances such as, and you see here an anti-radiation missile that's been fired at this SAM from a plane a long way away. That SAM could, in theory, fire back at that plane, but if it doesn't, and if it goes off the air, the AGM is not going to be able to hit the target because the radar's been switched off. But it has done its job, at least for this turn, of suppressing the sound, you see. So you can get these sort of nuances, but only if you don't confine the combat to one turn and you have a delay, as I've shown here. Okay. Penultimate slide. Sorry for taking more time than I'd hoped, but we still have time for discussion. All the games that I've shown there are I Go, You Go. They range from the Grand Strategic to the Ultra Tactical. They range from Ancient to World War II. All of them use I Go, You Go. It does seem to me to be an extremely flexible and simple system, which can be made to work, even to model, albeit indirectly and abstractly in many ways, the simultaneous reality, just as well, if not in many cases better, than alternative systems. The key point, final slide, is that this is a game. This is not a simulation that the computer can run just by itself. Player decisions are vital here, and a simple game that can be played is going to teach you more than a complex game that cannot. My second chapter in Simulating War is entitled Accuracy versus Simplicity. So getting people to be able to play the games is fundamental. And looking for a system, in my case it's I Go, You Go, which allows them to be accessible in that way and allows them therefore to get at the other mechanics which the game is trying to model, is really important. That's it from me. As I say, sorry to take a little bit longer, but lots and lots of things to discuss. On to questions and discussion.
Your questions, please, everyone.
So you talked a lot about simultaneity between red and blue, but there's also issues that I've run into with simultaneity between blue and blue, which most commonly comes up with transport, where exploits come out where a unit can get picked up by one transport, dropped off, picked up by another, dropped off, picked up by a third, and it, even with an impulse system or a fairly elaborate systems, ends up breaking down the notion of what actually happened in real time. You have thoughts on that and how that's different than the red-blue interaction?
Yeah, I'm just trying at the moment to see if I can get out of my screen sharing. Oh, stop sharing your screen a little bit. Right, good. You should now be seeing me. Yeah, absolutely. I talked about this this blue versus blue, and as I say, looking at the way that this is done within Trial of Strength is interesting. And effectively, what you need to do is to stop moving one unit, record how many action points it's used, and then go on and move another one. And then when they're collaborating together, be it units moving onto the transport or they're collaborating in attack, level everyone up, such that those who have already got there ages ago need to wait until the final cog comes in, and that those action points are wasted. You see, it's far harder to implement in practice than it is to describe.
I think
which is what.
Yeah, I think we had settled something like that, and it was very confusing to the players, to the point where it was a disproportionate percentage of the rules explanation for how units coordinated activity. I don't know if you had thoughts on how to do that in a simpler way.
Absolutely. Well, as I say, there's no magic answer to it. What you need to look at is, can you find a workaround which gets you 80% of the way there for 20% of the rules overhead? And for many people, that's move and fight, frankly. Okay, everybody moves and then they fight at the end of the turn, rather than saying it's possible to fight at the beginning of the turn and exploit through the enemy. Or you have, and this came up very early on when people realized if you move and then fight, you create a hole, but then the enemy can plug it before you get a chance to exploit. You move, fight, and move. But everybody does that. You move your entire force, fight in one unified combat phase, and then you exploit, at least with armor, or it may only be some parts of your force that are allowed to do that, you see. But the reason that we have these monolithic phases is precisely because of the problems of trying to do it, in collaboration with all of these forces, able to be as flexible as they possibly wish. That it's fine for it. It works well for campaigns because you have one army not coordinating with another army doing things in isolation. It doesn't work that well for frontal warfare where people are routinely collaborating and therefore the phase system is often seen as the second best. But as I say, I discuss it a lot in my book. But there's no magic answer. There's just the more complex or the 80% solution.
One of the questions here in the chat is, can you discuss how the dynamics of simultaneity changes when you move from one player per side to multiple players per side, or to add to that, there are multiple sides and more than just two?
Absolutely, yeah. One thing that you find, and of course this beautifully reflects the real world, is if you've got multiple players on a single side, a game that might be quite quick to resolve with two players takes a hell of a lot longer. Now, it might be productive time because they're spending lots of time discussing what to do. Just as a war cabinet will take a lot more time to take a decision than a dictator who just says, "We'll do this." Yeah, it illustrates perfectly the OODA loop delays, but it may not be what you want because you're trying to get through the game quickly. Running games with multiple players shows you why things happen slowly in real life with lots and lots of people. Excuse me. Obviously, the more sides you have, the more of a problem of reconciling simultaneity if everybody plans what to do, and then someone has to work out what on earth is the outcome of that, and to reconcile all of these plans, you see. If you're an umpire, for example, and you've got 6 different sets of orders that have come into you, and you have to resolve that turn, you have to do it very quickly, you're then the choke point. It's fine, you can have 100 sides, and this is why I have no idea how Rex Briner manages to do this. He runs pretty much single-handedly a game with 100 players, and he himself manages to be the umpire in all of this and to make sure that things happen and to resolve what goes on. But it takes a particular special kind of person to be able to do that. Normally, the umpire just basically falls over. Or of course, you have multiple umpires who try and resolve this, but then how do the umpires coordinate among one another? Because in the end, what you're creating is one unified outcome, interactive, of this enormously complex, multi-dimensional system, you see. So again, there are no simple answers to this, but it just makes things more complicated.
Other questions?
Real quick question, David Redpath here, calling from Canada, in the snow. The use of zones of control and I was going to say doctrinal short OODA loop activity like German counterattacks and so on and so forth in World War II. It seems to me that there's at least a couple of mechanics, and you mentioned it in that Chinese farm one there, where you've got FPFs and zones and so on. Things like that, those types of techniques that were used in some of those games back in the 70s and 80s and actually sort of perfected then, can help to stop, I was going to say, unrealistic outcomes of movement and combat. Do you think that there's something more that can be done with those types of mechanisms? They're actually very easy to explain to players as well and very quick to resolve.
I think zones of control came about not for the reason I've highlighted, but for a much more practical reason. People wanted high definition maps, but they didn't want to have hundreds of counters, which you would need to hold continuous fronts if you didn't have zones of control. So basically, zones of control, I think, originated as a counter-saving mechanic, so that a single counter could hold 2 or 3 hexes of front. They have then the serendipitous property that they stick units together and allow, I think, a much more realistic reflection of frontal dynamics than, for example, in a system that Thai bomber became enamored with for a while 20 years ago, with no zones of control, where literally you could have a line of 20 units guarding a 21 hex front, and the one hole is the hole through which everybody funnels, and the 20 units can do nothing about it. Well, that's patently bizarre and ridiculous, and also shows the limits of the hexagon system, because those units wouldn't leave a one hex gap; they would just spread out and shuffle along. So it does seem to me that zones of control have a lot going for them. I'm not actually that much of a fan of the ZOC bond system, which says that you can slide along the enemy front but not go through between units, because I don't think you should be able to slide along the enemy front, precisely because this is not a passive enemy. This is an active enemy who is able to react to you. You can play a lot with zones of control. You can make them permeable, so some forces can go through them, like armor. You can have so-called active zones of control, which mean that you have to attack if you move next to the enemy, or you can have ones which simply hold you in place or force you to move away rather than sliding past the enemy. So there's all sorts of ways in which these things can be used. It does seem to me to be one of the most crucial game design elements. That said, what's a zone of control? In reality, people often do have problems thinking in terms of zones of control because it doesn't have the same reality as supply or movement or bombardment, you see. And so it's all very well for grognards to talk in this way, but zones of control like hexes, frankly, are one of the things that put normal people off. So you do need to be a little bit careful of starting from where people are at.
Yeah, I think professional military people understand zones of influence and zones of observation, fire effect zones. That's not a problem. I don't find that's a problem. I find most professional players understand the concept. We might call it zones of control in a hobby format, but
no, you're right. You're right. But hexes, for example, the Camberley Kriegspiel uses squares, and partly because hexes are seen as the beardy, hobby gamer alternative, whereas squares are what's on real people's maps. It makes the design a hell of a lot more difficult, but it makes it more acceptable, you see. So there's an example.
Other questions? Okay. Not hearing any at this point. I think we'll wrap it up at this point. I want to say thank you to Phil Sabin for an excellent, excellent presentation. I am attempting to get one of our other cops to give the modeling and simulation perspective to this exact same problem. We'll let you know when that particular lecture has been scheduled. Just as a reminder, next week, Wednesday, on the 3rd, Arnell David, Lieutenant Colonel, British Army, will be talking to us about the UK Wargame Fight Club, Operation Thunderclap. That should also be a very, very good lecture. But once again, thank you to the audience, and thank you again to Dr. Sabin for joining us for this lecture. See you next week.
My pleasure, and stay safe.